They laughed when Bertrand Lacombe said he was going to let the back 40 flood. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind you get when someone makes a joke that doesn't quite land. This was the full-body kind. The kind that starts in the chest and ends with a man slapping the hood of his truck. René Gauthier started it, right there in the co-op parking lot in Sainte-Agnès, on a Wednesday morning in early April when the frost was barely out of the ground. René laughed, and then his brother-in-law laughed, and then a couple of the Pelletier boys from the next road over laughed, and by the time Bertrand got back in his pickup and drove home, the whole thing had made the rounds at the Tim Hortons on the highway. Let me tell you about Bertrand Lacombe. He was 53 years old that spring, built the way men get built when they've spent their lives doing actual work, not gym work, but the kind where you don't notice you're getting strong because you're too busy getting things done. He had his father's hands and his mother's stubbornness, and he'd been farming the same 220 acres outside Sainte-Agnès, Quebec, since he was 31 years old. Before that, he'd spent 8 years with the Provincial Drainage Board riding out to farms across the eastern townships with a clipboard and a set of topographic maps, telling people where their water was going and why. That was the part nobody in Sainte-Agnès ever really thought about. They saw a farmer. They didn't see the 8 years. His wife, Danielle, had heard the Tim Hortons story by noon. She didn't say anything when he came in for lunch. She put a bowl of soup in front of him and sat down across the table and said, "They're saying you've lost your mind." Bertrand looked at his soup. "They're saying that, are they?" René says the back 40 is the best draining land you've got. Says you're throwing money away. René, Bertrand said, hasn't looked at a soil survey in his life. Danielle watched him. She'd been with this man for 27 years. She knew the difference between the times he was being stubborn and the times he was being right. She wasn't always sure which this was. But she'd learned, over 2.5 decades, that those two things were not always as different as people assumed. She let it go. Have you ever known something so thoroughly, down in the bones of you, in the part that forms before language does, and still had to stand there while someone else laughed at it? That was Bertrand Lacombe's spring. It had started the previous autumn, the way most things on a farm start, quietly, with something you noticed but didn't quite name yet. They'd had a wet September, wetter than usual, in the field that the Lacombe family had always called the back 40, though it was closer to 37 acres, a number that had never quite made it into the family vocabulary, had held water longer than the neighbors' fields. René Gauthier's land drained into the ditch within a week. The Pelletier's land drained in 4 or 5 days. The back 40 held water for 3 full weeks before the surface finally dried enough to walk on. Most people would have seen that as a problem. Bertrand saw it as information. He'd spent 8 years with the drainage board walking fields just like this one, and he'd learned something that the agronomists who came after him, the ones who pushed the tile drainage systems and the big capital investments, had either forgotten or never quite understood. Not all slow drainage is the same. Some land holds water because it's waterlogged, the kind of saturation that drowns roots and compacts soil and kills a crop before it starts. But some land holds water because the soil itself is acting like a sponge, moving moisture down slowly into the layers below, recharging something deeper, something that doesn't show up in a one-season observation, something you need years, sometimes decades, to read correctly. The back 40 was the second kind. Bertrand had known it since he first walked the property with his father 30 years ago. His father hadn't known the technical language for it, but he'd said, standing in the middle of that field in rubber boots with water around his ankles, "This field has memory, Bertrand, don't rush it." His father had been a man of very few words. Those were the ones Bertrand kept. He'd been watching the back 40 for 22 years. He had a notebook, not a digital file, an actual lined notebook. The kind you get at the Dollarama, where he wrote down the field's water levels every spring. He'd started doing it the year he bought the property because it was habit from the drainage board days, and he'd kept doing it because the numbers were telling him something he wanted to understand. What they told him, taken together over 2 decades, was this. In years with heavy spring snowmelt or a wet September, the back 40 recharged a shallow aquifer that sat beneath his property, the 2 properties on either side of him. That aquifer fed a spring-fed pond on the east end of his land, which in turn fed a small stream that ran through the corner of the Gauthier property. In dry years, and there had been 3 of those in the last decade that Bertrand would call genuinely dry, that pond stayed full when René Gauthier's dugout ran low, stayed full when the pelletiers were hauling water for their cattle. The aquifer was the insurance policy, and the back 40 was the mechanism. Now the provincial drainage incentive program was offering money, real money, the kind that changes your cash flow situation for 3 years, to install subsurface tile drainage and turn wetland into productive cropland. René Gauthier had already signed up. Both Pelletier farms were enrolled. The program's agronomist, a young man named Thibodeau, who drove a clean truck and had been licensed for 4 years, had come out to the Lacombe farm in February, walked the back 40 in snowshoes, and told Bertrand it was a high-priority candidate for the program. Bertrand had listened to everything Thibodeau said. He'd asked 3 or 4 questions. Then he'd said, "I appreciate you coming out. I'm going to pass." Thibodeau had blinked. Nobody passed on this program. Mr. Lacombe, the per-acre subsidy alone, would cover. "I know what it covers," Bertrand said. "I've seen the numbers." "Then you understand this field is essentially unproductive as. You're losing yield every year. You don't drain it." Bertrand had looked out at the back 40, flat, winter gray, unremarkable to any eye that didn't know what it was carrying, i.e., underneath. He'd said, "That field is doing work you can't see in the yield reports." Thibodeau had written something on his clipboard. Bertrand suspected it was not complimentary, and that was how it started. By April, when the co-op parking lot incident happened, the story had calcified into something simple. Bertrand Lacombe had turned down free government money because he had some idea about his wet field. René thought it was the Pelletiers thought it was the kind of stubbornness that ran in old farming families and eventually cost them the farm. Thibodeau, if he thought about it at all, probably thought it was ignorance dressed up as wisdom. None of them had read the notebook. That summer was ordinary. Bertrand planted the back 40 with a forage mix instead of corn, clover, and timothy, and a bit of alfalfa, which required no drainage and actually benefited from the moisture retention. His yield numbers on that field were modest, nothing to write home about. René Gauthier's newly tiled fields came in strong. 60 bushels of corn per acre, maybe more. The Pelletiers were happy. Thibodeau sent Bertrand a note in August with the regional yield averages, which Bertrand read and then put in the drawer with the notebook. Nobody laughed anymore, exactly. But nobody had changed their minds, either. The thing about being right in a way that's invisible is that it looks exactly like being wrong, until it doesn't. The following summer was drier. Not catastrophically, not yet, but Bertrand noticed. June came in with about 60% of normal rainfall. His spring-fed pond, which usually ran right to the edge of the old fence posts by July, was sitting 8 inches lower than he'd ever recorded it in his notebook. That was the first signal. He didn't say anything to anyone, he just wrote it down. The second summer, 2 years after the co-op parking lot, was the one that changed things. It started dry in May and stayed dry. By the 3rd week of June, the radio was using the word drought, which radio in this part of Quebec was reluctant to do. because the word carried a kind of finality that people in a place with 4 distinct seasons resisted. But by the 3rd week of June, there was no other word for it. The corn in René Gauthier's fields was rolling its leaves by 10 in the morning, trying to protect what moisture it had left. The pelletiers had started watching their dugout, which had dropped 2 feet in 3 weeks. A dugout that had watered their cattle for 15 years without a problem. Bertrand walked the back 40 every morning that June. The forage mix was struggling. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but it was alive. The clover was more drought-tolerant than corn, and it had root systems that went down deeper than anything you'd plant for grain. More importantly, the spring-fed pond was 8 inches lower than normal, yes, but it was full. It had not dropped the way the Gauthier's dugout had dropped. The water was still coming. He checked his well on the 3rd of July. The water table was down. He'd expected that. But it was down less than it should have been. His neighbor, 2 concessions over, a man named Patrice Vaillancourt, who had no connection to the drainage program either way, had called him the week before to say his well was pulling air. Bertrand's well was not pulling air. He went back and looked at the notebook that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner while Danielle watched the news in the other room. He went back 15 years to the last dry summer he'd marked as genuinely difficult. In that year, his well had dropped 4 feet by August. This year, it was down 2. The back 40 had been unmodified in both years. But in the intervening years, the 3 heavy snowmelt springs had all gone into the ground the way they always had, slowly, through that 37-acre sponge, down into the aquifer below. The tile drainage on René's land and the pelletier's land meant those fields shed water fast now, into the ditch, down the road allowance, into the river. The water that used to take 3 weeks to move through a field now moved through in 3 days. It didn't have time to go down. It only had time to go sideways. They had improved their yields in the good years. They had reduced their insurance in the bad ones, and they wouldn't know it until the bad year arrived. Which it had. He didn't call René to tell him this. He thought about it, and then he thought about the co-op parking lot, and he decided that a man who needed to say, "I told you so," probably hadn't been as sure as he thought he was. Bertrand had been sure. He didn't need to say anything. But René came to him. It was the 2nd week of July. René Gauthier pulled into the Lacombe yard in his truck, which was dusty, in the way that trucks only get in a real drought when the gravel roads turn to powder. He got out slowly. René was a big man, 61 years old, with the kind of face that didn't give much away, and he stood by the truck for a moment looking at Bertrand's yard. Bertrand came out of the barn. He waited. "Your pond's still got water," René said. It wasn't a question. "It does," Bertrand said. René was quiet for a moment. He looked out toward the back 40, which you could just see from the yard, the dusty green-gray of the forage mix, not lush, not what you'd call thriving, but standing. "Alive, how?" René said. Bertrand told him. Not the whole 22 years of notebook, not right there in the yard, but enough. He told him about the aquifer. He told him about the recharge rate. He told him about the difference between water you can see moving and water you can't see staying. René listened without interrupting, which was not something René did often. When Bertrand finished, René said, "The drainage board, you worked there." 8 years, Bertrand said. René nodded. He looked at his boots. Then he said, "My dugout's down 3 feet. I've got 60 head that need water." "I know," Bertrand said. "I can run a line from your pond?" Bertrand thought about it for about 3 seconds. "Yeah," he said, "you can run a line." They didn't shake hands. Men who grew up on farms in that part of Quebec didn't shake hands over things like this. They just did them. René went back to his truck, and Bertrand went back to the barn, and the next morning René showed up with pipe, and they spent the day running a water line from the spring-fed pond to a trough near the property line. The Pelletiers called the week after. Bertrand said yes to them too. He never said, "I told you so," to anyone. Not to Renee, not to the Pelletiers, not to young Thibodeau from the drainage program, who had driven past on the road one afternoon and slowed down in a way that suggested he'd noticed the pond. If Thibodeau had questions, maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he was doing the math in his own head, which was his right. Let me tell you what Bertrand understood that the others didn't, and it's this. A farm is not a machine. You don't optimize a farm the way you optimize a machine, because a machine doesn't have memory, and a farm does. The back 40 had been doing the same thing for 10,000 years before Bertrand's father stood in it in rubber boots, and it would do the same thing for 1,000 years after, moving water down, slowly, the way it knew how, into the stone and clay below. When you put a tile system in the ground and changed the speed of that movement, you weren't just improving drainage, you were changing the memory, and memory, once changed, is very hard to recover. Danielle asked him that fall, when the rains finally came back and the drought broke and the province let out a collective breath it had been holding since May. She asked him if he was glad he'd made the choice he made. He thought about that for a while. They were sitting on the porch in the first real rain of September, watching it come down on the back 40, watching the land do what it had always done, drink slowly, hold carefully, give back over time. "I'm not glad," he said. "Glad isn't the right word." "What's the right word?" He watched the rain. "I knew," he said. "That's all. I just knew." There's a thing that happens in farming communities, and maybe in all communities, though farming ones are where I've seen it most clearly, where the person who's been paying attention the longest gets heard the least. Because paying attention doesn't look like much from the outside. It doesn't look like action. It doesn't generate yield reports or subsidy numbers or anything you can point to and say, "Here, this is the value of what I've been doing." Bertrand Lacombe had a notebook with 22 years of water levels in it. That notebook was never going to win him a provincial agricultural award. It was never going to show up in anyone's cost-benefit analysis. But in the summer the drought came, the real drought, the one that turned the gravel roads to powder and pulled 3 feet of water out of René Gauthier's dugout and made Patrice Vaillancourt's well pull air. That notebook was the most valuable thing on 220 acres of land in Sainte-Agnès, Quebec, and the back 40 was still standing. The observation point Bertrand had marked on his hand-drawn farm map, a spot near the east fence line where a piece of rebar stuck out of the ground, which he'd hammered in himself in the spring of the year he bought the property, so he'd have something to measure the water against. That piece of rebar showed the same watermarks in September of the drought year as it had in every year before. Not because nothing had changed, but because the thing beneath the ground that mattered most had been protected. Some things you can only see if you've been watching long enough. Some investments don't show up until the moment everything else stops working. And some people get laughed at in the co-op parking lot on a Wednesday morning in April, and they drive home and they eat their soup, and they go back out to the field in the afternoon and keep doing exactly what they know is right. Bertrand Lacombe was that kind of man. The back 40 is still there. The rebar is still there. The notebook has 34 years of entries in it now, and Bertrand's oldest daughter, who studied environmental science at Laval and came back to the farm 4 years ago, has started keeping her own notes in a new book. Same format, same field, same piece of rebar. She doesn't need anyone to explain to her why.